Hi, I'm Tom Schofield from Culture Lab in Newcastle University, UK, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-authors John Bowers and Diego Trujillo Pisanty. So one area that's seen substantial and varied interest in design in HCI is in the introduction of influences from creative writing and literary criticism. And to this 2020 we bring what we believe is a new example of one such influence, Magical Realism. And I'll say more shortly about why we think that's a good idea. First, we'll examine some existing examples of the relationships researchers have created between creative literature, criticism and design. Then we'll consider for a moment how this has presented a challenge to dominant paradigms of doing and conceptualizing design. We ground our interest in magical realism with the introduction of a research project which explored the possibility of developing influences from magical realism into the design of an augmented reality app. Our reflections on some of the unresolved designs within this process leads us to examine some features of magical realism and the challenge they pose for doing design. Our contribution is as follows. We introduce magical realism as an informant to HCI, asking what a magical realist design could look like. Notably, on a conceptual level, we consider how the worldview of much design practice can be fundamentally challenged by a critical encounter with magical realism. Engaging with these two concerns forms the contribution of this paper. We're far from the first to consider how literature or its surrounding critical scholarship might helpfully or provocatively reframe design. In our paper we describe a number of such influences. People have used literature, I'd say, in a couple of ways. The first is as a challenge to methodology, and the second is a resource of content. And it was the second one in some ways that shaped our expectations as to how we would use magical realism in our work. So I'll just give a couple of examples. So the influence of science fiction and fantasy writing on design in HCI has become most obvious since Julian Bleeker's formulation of design fictions in 2009. But as he himself points out, earlier examples exist. We might say that the future orientation of sci-fi, combined with the evocative and immersive nature of storytelling, produces a rich environment to imagine the experience of living with future technologies. Though in the paper we discuss some of the problems of exoticism, orientalism and so forth that can go along with these moves. Our work began with a similar orientation, asking what we could learn from magical realism, treating it as a challenging topic or resource for a critical HCI. Literature can bring a shift in an understanding of what knowledge is important, and the rupture brought by new epistemological perspectives to existing research is described by Harrison as making epistemological trouble. It's such a state of trouble we believe that magical realism brings to the normal business of interaction design. The nature of that trouble is partly in the disruption it brings to the very process of imagining the world and by extension the technologies within it. So Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto made this move in disrupting the core imaginary of technological thinking, its very mythology, with the image of the cyborg. Magical realism offers an opportunity to reflect on a series of otherwise situated imaginaries to examine how, in fiction, they play out in detail through people's lives. So, magical realist literature frequently deals with supernatural events as if they had a distinctly everyday character. Indeed, in magical realist novels, it's frequently unclear whether events are unfolding in what we would commonly understand as a magical, fantastical or otherworldly setting, or in the imaginations of the protagonists, and what the relationship of such worlds is to the rest of the diegetic context. So magic is no longer quixotic madness, but normative and normalizing. It is a simple matter of the most complicated source, so says Faris. We've already described at DIS how we undertook a series of design workshops with children and knowledge specialists to develop an AR app that embedded digitally developed versions of sketches and notes from the archive of an author of children's literature, David Almond, into a walking tour with various interactions attaching to them, inspired by magical realist work. During the course of our development process, a number of ideas arose and re-arose which we were unable to directly act upon within our design. In time, we came to the position that the incommensurability of our understanding of good interaction design on the one hand and the value and interests of magical realism on the other was not a shortcoming of ourselves as designers and developers, or at least not purely. Rather, these were indications that something more interesting was going on. With our talk today, we want to talk about ways that we were not successful in making these kinds of translation, thinking back to our point about the challenges literature can pose, and think about why that was so. So novels can be long, some of them very long, and the events that happen within them still longer. During our project, we were interested to explore the idea of AR objects as sites of exchange between publics at different times during the day or across weeks, months or years for others to encounter later. We imagine the possibility that objects might acquire a patina of age through repeated interactions that degraded or renewed them. Returning to magical realism, though, and minded that our job now is to treat this not as a resource to be used, but as a challenge to thinking, we remember that critics have observed that the long, intergenerational time spans of some magical realist work facilitate challenges between one generation and the next. So, in 100 Years of Solitude, fantastic objects such as magnifying glasses, ice, and magnets come to be surpassed by other technologies such as the law. Meanwhile, Seth, the protagonist of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, lives constantly with the haunting of presences from other times, the tree on her back inflicted by slave masters, and the ongoing presence of her dead baby bring these challenges forward in ways that strongly disrupt the present. In David Allman's book For Children, Heaven Eyes, the characters spend time in an abandoned print works which appears to exist both in current time and parallel to it. So the time of magical realism is sometimes foregrounded so as to provoke questions about the difference between one generation and the next, one political regime to another, my great-grandmother's values and beliefs compared to mine. Time here is particular, and it often has the function of affording a form of social commentary. A response to examples like this is to attempt to directly translate them into design ideas, for instance by imagining how we might design artefacts that lay hidden for generations. We resist such ideas, however, observing how the significance of these intergenerational interactions derive their very meaning from their embeddedness in the life worlds of the characters, a context which cannot be meaningfully recreated if translated out of the diegesis and into the real lives of people using technology. So we might legitimately ask what we can say or imagine to explore intergenerational time through our design choices. To do so, let's return briefly to our AR app design space. We describe in the paper how it's almost certainly impossible to design AR objects using current tools with generational lifespans. Might we, though, have considered the imaginations of fictional characters who themselves are in the position of interpreting presences from the past, as embodied in objects and their surrounding mythologies, and are thus developing their own intergenerational imaginaries? Let me explain. So the ghostly baby in Beloved and the gold that continually reappears in 100 Years of Solitude all provoke complex and imaginative retrospective understanding in the characters who live with them, and we, the reader, join them, the characters, in this speculative mood. Let's remember that speculation can take place with regard to the past as well as the future, so we wonder how it can be supported. In particular, we can see from these examples how the perdurance of the various remnants from previous generations challenges the characters of the present time. We want to ask in our designs if examples such as these could not provoke in us an attitude of critical imagination towards the past. As the children's presence in the abandoned print works in Heaven Eyes provokes them to both imagine the site as it was and to reappraise their fixedness in their own time, can we imagine design things that similarly cast us into a state of situated ambiguity with regard to the worlds of the past, real or imagined? Being cast outside of the proper time is not the only way that objects or technologies have political force in magical realism. We described earlier how the ontological disruption, the rift in the way that the world ought to be brought about by the presence of the fantastical or marvellous in magical realism, gives permission for a cultural or political disruption. In our own work, we tried to respond to themes of haunting or unrealness, but these were always limited to representations, like you can see in the grab there. The presence in magical realism of, for us, what is magical, fantastical, marvellous or otherwise unreal, is characterised as part of lived experience, supporting wider narrative strategies in novels, and allowing the expression of socio-political points, such as foregrounding women's voices in interrelationships in Allende and the brutalities of slavery in Morrison. There's an interesting comparison here with moves in design literature that provoke a tactic of making by making strange, as Bell et al. Put it. Some authors have even proposed haunting as a method by which to accomplish so-called defamiliarization. Where some of such work uses the formal qualities of ghostly presence to inspire interactions, we suggest that the treatment of this device, haunting, within magical realism differs. The presence of the fantastical as normative within magical realism runs counter to the idea of defamiliarization itself. Rather than making strange, magical realism functions by, as we put it, making the fantastical familiar. The very rhetorical work done by asserting the strange as the normal, we suggest, acts as a counterpart to the impulse to rationalize design, and that's a valuable corrective. We're conscious that we've concentrated on the positive perspectives brought by magical realism to design thinking, but we need to acknowledge that the genre itself is troubled or enlivened with debate over gender, race or other axes of diversity in politics. It's not our contention that magical realism offers an easy path for designers working towards a more diverse HCI, or that by mimicking its style or content we will necessarily come up with better designs. The risk of producing parody is high, as is that of committing forms of appropriation. Similarly, we acknowledge that we speak from our own positions, except that we do not speak uniquely for magical realism, and indeed must consider carefully what we do and do not have the right to say about it. The genre should be treated not just as a topic, nor only as a resource, but notably as a context of engagement. With this phase, we intend to offer a distinction between a resource which is drawn upon when needed and ignored when it isn't, and a context in which one stages a multivalent exchange around cultures, histories, theories, artefacts and practices. Design then becomes a meeting point for concerns, in our case those of HCI and those of literature, where at least in principle many different and potentially reciprocal exchanges are possible.